Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Just My Stupid Opinion. I'm Adrian Lloyd, and today I have two stories that I wanted to discuss with you. I'm going to go into what I think is the most important one first, and that's going to be talking about the how Ottawa has decided that 11 communities will be pilot projects for a new immigration plan. And the second one is going to be discussing how the federal government has just labeled climate change a federal emergency now. So both of them are going to be not quite what they seem to be, but I want to start off with the immigration one because I feel like this is the one that's more pressing to us right now. So, as this article from CBC says that came out on June 14th, 2019, Ottawa picks 11 communities for pilot immigration program. The federal government has picked 11 communities from across Canada to kick off a new pilot program aimed at attracting immigrants to rural and northern communities. The goal of the program is to bring newcomers to regions confronting severe labor shortages due to youth exodus, declining birth rate, and aging population. Immigration Minister Ahmed Hussein is making a formal announcement today in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Quote, "The equation is quite simple. Attracting and retaining newcomers with the needed skills equals a recipe for success for Canada's rural and northern communities. We have tested a similar immigration pilot in Atlantic Canada and has already shown tremendous results for both newcomers and Canadians." End quote. The selected communities are Thunder Bay, Ontario, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Sudbury, Ontario, Timmins, Ontario, Northern Bay, Ontario, Gretna, Rhineland, Altona, Plum, Cooley, Manitoba, Brandon, Manitoba, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Claresholm, Alberta, West Kootenay region of BC, and Vernon, BC. Communities were selected as a representative sample of regions to lay out a blueprint for the rest of the country. About 78% of newcomers in Canada settle in big cities such as Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver under existing federal economic immigration programs. Rural Economic Development Minister Bernadette Jordan said that the pilot program will support the economic development of the communities by testing new, community-driven approaches to fill diverse labor market needs. Okay, so that's what it ended up saying. And as always, it's never what it appears to be. There, I think, is 3 different reasons as to why they have decided to do this. And it has to do with tax revenue, has to do with elections, and has to do with replacement. They come off as saying that it has something to do with the fact that, we got an aging population, we got youth exodus, so we need these people up in these communities. When this is nothing short of a lie. Like, there's some truth to that these sort of things end up happening. But whenever I actually hear, since this came out, whenever I did hear from someone who kind of came from maybe not these specific rural regions, but came from a rural region, they said that wasn't really the case. That there may be some of this going on, but they wouldn't say that they're actually in a crisis where they need immigrants to come in. Now, the first one has to do with elections, because it's no real doubt that this is the real reason that a government wants to bring in immigrants. They want to bring in immigrants who will then achieve citizenship and be able to vote for them. This has been shown time and time again, all throughout history. The problem is that typically when it comes to immigrants, that is a leftist plan, a liberal plan, because a lot of the immigrants that come in don't tend to vote conservative. There are definitely those who do. But kind of what ends up happening is you bring them in, bring them in from poor communities, and then you give them free tax money, you give them welfare, you give them social benefits, you give them health care, and they're going to vote for that party that brought them in and did that for them, even though these people have never paid a dime in taxpayers' money. And you put them into communities where you know that they will vote for you, and that way you can turn this community, this riding specifically, into a riding that will vote for you. I do have a suspicion that I've talked about in the past about the Liberal List server, and the Liberal List server is used by the Liberal Party, both federal and provincial, although it's primarily a federal government tool, and it is this database, and the database collects a bunch of different information from different ridings all across Canada, and from there they can kind of figure out what size family you have, where your origins are from, how you'll vote, what are your preferences, what's important to you. And in doing so, they can kind of build up a profile on the type of community that lives in that riding, and then they can target their campaign promises to people in that community. Now, I'm sure this goes much farther. I mean, I'm sure this has a lot of data harvesting that we see in like Google and Facebook as well. But I have a feeling that specifically these 11 communities that they named, there's some significance to them, although it is just at the end of the day, it's a pilot program for what they're going to do for the rest of the country. If we kind of take a look at a map here, this is a map from Elections Canada, and it's showing the results of the 42nd election that took place in 2015, the one that ended up getting Justin Trudeau elected. And we can see that when it came to the cities, the big cities, they tended to vote for the left-wing party. This is actually one of the reasons that I believe that they don't actually have, it's not as important for them to move these immigrants into the cities because they already have these cities. We're talking Montreal, we're talking Vancouver, we're talking Toronto, and these are all areas that have, they can be swing ridings in there for sure, but a lot of times, if you take a look on the map who they vote for, they'll vote for the Liberals more often than they'll vote for the Conservatives. And especially this is important in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, because the Greater Toronto Area has some of the most ridings in all of Canada. If you can dominate the GTA, then you more or less have that election in the bag. That's where they want to campaign the most. You can't solely win an election based on that, but if you can dominate the GTA, you have a damn good chance of winning the upcoming election. But a lot of the rural communities throughout the rest of the provinces, even in Ontario, those tend to vote a lot for conservative governments. We look about a year ago when Doug Ford ended up getting elected in Ontario. It was pretty much Ottawa and Toronto that were the holdouts that kind of gave the NDP and the Liberals a fighting chance, and a little bit of Northern Ontario for sure. But the rest of the area, we're talking Southern Ontario, Central Ontario, and even a fair amount of Northern Ontario, were all blue, all completely blue. The problem is that each one of these ridings it takes up a lot of territory, and it's simply one riding. Every single riding that you can snatch away is important. This is why they campaign a lot in swing ridings, because even those little swing ridings are very important. And I believe this is sort of what they're going to be doing. Because right now there's a lot of swing ridings in those three cities that I ended up naming, which was Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. I ended up finding this when I was doing my research. It was an article from Hill and Knowlton Strategies, and it was talking about Election 41 is being played out by the swing ridings. So this one is going back to 2011, but as it ends up saying in here, they say, swing ridings are scattered across Canada in every province and in 2 or 3 territories, but a great significant number of these are concentrated in 3 main areas: Vancouver and the lower BC mainland, the Greater Toronto Area, including Kitchener, Guelph, and Niagara, and some ridings in Quebec. Really, those ridings in Quebec, I think they're talking about, have to do with Quebec City and Montreal, but those ones are probably fairly well dominated as well. But they have enough that they can probably capture these swing ridings. They can capture them already, but the thing is these swing ridings become less significant if they can start going in, infiltrating these right-wing dominated ridings, and then start changing them so that way they are going to vote red, or they're going to vote more specifically for the left-wing party. See, I don't think that the Liberals and the NDP dislike each other nearly as much as they play on, because they're on the same side. They're on the left-wing side. They may disagree on semantics, but all in all, I have no doubt that the Liberals would prefer to see an NDP government get elected than a Conservative government, and vice versa. The NDP would prefer to have a Liberal government elected for that very reason. So they could quickly lay out some of the areas too where they believe that the swing ridings in this election ended up taking place, and Atlantic Canada was one. And this was also an area where they did this pilot program. Quebec has been getting on, they were at one point taking on a fair amount of immigrants. That's changed now, because now, literally out of all these programs, There is nothing in Quebec for this pilot program that's going to be in this. And also, Trudeau has allowed Quebec to pretty much decide which immigrants they want to take on and how many. They've not done this for the rest of the country. So you got that. It has to do with voting. It also has to do with taxes, because the more people you bring in, the more taxpayers bring in, the more revenue you bring in. And this is why they've also been raising taxes on all Canadians. Even just recently, the Liberal Party on Twitter ended up putting out something where they said they lowered taxes for middle-class Canadians. I've shown before that this is not true. There's an article that you can show, I think it was by the Financial Post, where it was saying that actually something like 85% of the middle class have actually seen their taxes increase since Justin Trudeau ended up getting elected. So that's not the case whatsoever. And the third one has to do with replacement migration. This is something that I've talked a little bit about before. I know other people do as well. But it's a very important factor that has to be taking place, because right now, something between 22 and 25% of the people living in Canada are immigrants, not Canadian citizens, technically, or they are first-generation Canadian citizens, not native-born Canadians. And we know that the fertility rate and the birth rate has been dropping in Canada, and this is a perfect way in order to encourage people that they need more immigrants. In fact, something that's kind of plays out in the second story as well is that they tell us we have a climate emergency. They tell us that we have to have less children because the more people on this planet will actually raise our carbon footprint. And Canada has to meet the Paris climate agreements. But then they're going to say, oh, we need more immigrants in Canada. That is going to have more children, raise our carbon footprint. And they don't see any logical fallacy in that. But this has actually been something that has been used a lot. I did an episode recently where I talked about the Kalergi plan, about how it was had to do with to replace the people of Europe. And this also applies to in America, here in Canada. Pretty much the Western countries are the ones that are being targeted, but you don't see this same sort of targeting going over for the Middle East countries, the African countries, the Asian countries. Nobody is encouraging that China take on mass amounts of migration to the point that we have seen. And there's actually, when it came to Europe, there was actually a plan that it was put in place. There's this article that came from express.co.uk that was released on October 11th, 2008, called Secret Plot to Let 50 Million African Workers into the EU. A controversial taxpayer-funded job center opened in Mali this week in just the first step towards promoting free movement of people in Africa and the EU. Brussels Economist claims Britain and other EU states will need 56 million immigrant workers between them by 2050 to make up for the demographic decline due to the falling birth rates and rising death rates across Europe. The report by the EU statistical agency Eurostat warns that vast number of migrants could be needed to meet the shortfall in 2 years if Europe is to have a hope in funding the pension and health needs of the growing elderly population. So once again, this has more to do with the boomers, because a lot of what the boomers' policies, when they've had political power for a long, long time, one of the generations that have the most political power for a long period, for some of the longest period of times. So once again, they're doing this in order to appeal to the boomers' side, because many of these politicians still are the baby boomers. This is why it's happening, but and because they decided that they didn't want to have children, because they decided that it was they wanted to live their life free of care, and now they need to be looked after. It's the rest of the generations, my generation and the next generation and the generation before me, that has to make the sacrifices in order to look after these people. I know I've told my parents before already that I would, if when they reach the age that they can no longer look after themselves, I would rather they come and live with me than send them to a home. Sending them to a care home or to the hospital or something, that's the last decision I want to make. So long as we're not talking about a emergency that requires medical attention. But sending them to one of these retirement homes, I don't want to do that. I would rather spend the last 10 15 years of their life living with me so I could look after them, because they were the ones who looked after me for whatever 19, 20 years of my life before I moved out. But because many of these boomers didn't end up having children and wanted a free life, now it's the other people, it's the taxpayers that need to foot the bill, and they're constantly saying that we need more people here for, say, the medical industry. Well, the medical industry sucks. They're not giving the resources that's needed, and even though people are willing to go into it, what they have to deal with is ridiculous. Because I said before that my wife, she was, for a bit of time, she was a personal support worker, which are people that you hire them on, they go after, they look after you. They can't necessarily do much in the way of medical, but they can help you get up in the morning. They take care of stuff around your house so you don't have to worry about it. Just do the stuff that you can't do anymore, so long as it's not medical treatment. But even then, they have some limited stuff that they can do, such as changing catheters and that sort of thing. But the amount of hours that she got were ridiculously small for what is apparently a field that needs people in it. She was jumping around from one place to another, no more than, say, 2 hours, 3 at most, in one location. It was near impossible to get into a lot of these retirement homes and old age homes. And it was just, we were both shocked that this was the case when they were crying about how we need more people in this industry. Oh, we'll import more people from across the world in order so they can, so that way they can help in this field. Getting back to this article from the Express, it states, according to this report that they're talking about, it states, quote, countries with low fertility rates could require a significant number of immigrants over the coming decades if they want to maintain the existent number of people of working age. Having sufficient people of working age is vital to the economy and for tax revenue. So that plays back in to what I was just saying before. But the real reason that this is happening, because it's all about replacement. This is playing more into the UN Agenda 2030, but it has more to do these days with you've heard of wealth redistribution. Now the word that I've been seeing thrown around is regional distribution, or regional redistribution I've heard both ones done. But pretty much what they're saying now is that when it comes to wealth, we need to redistribute a lot of the wealth in order for people who don't have as much. Now they want to do the same with territory. And in fact, in some ways they have done in Canada when it came to giving a lot more sovereignty to the Indigenous people over their lands. I mean, it sucks what happened to them. I don't agree with a lot of the government policies that led up to it, or things such as the residential schools. But the point is, you're creating different classes here in Canada. In fact, they're just trying, or maybe it passed. You can take a quick Google search yourself, where they're now going to make it that a crime committed against an Indigenous person is worse than a crime that's committed against anybody else. So black, white, doesn't matter. So for it, they're saying that, just as an example, if, say, assault with a deadly weapon would get someone 5 years in prison against a white person or a black person or anyone else, if you do it against an Indigenous person, now you can get 8 years in prison, or so on, so on. So you're literally creating two classes of people now, and you know that in a few years' time, what's going to happen is, because we know that a lot of the Indigenous people, a lot of the Indigenous missing and murdered women, were killed by other Indigenous men. Some 70% of those were killed by other Indigenous men. So these Indigenous men are then going to commit these crimes, get harsher jail sentences, and then the left wing and the progressives and the liberals are going to cry about how unfair the justice system is to them, even though it was their policies that they put in themselves. But this plan that we're talking about, this document in order to bring the 50 million people into Europe, it was actually, funny enough, it was, I found another article that was sort of talking about this. And hold on, it starts about there. I missed some of it. Anyway, it says it's a very real policy that's already been planned by both the UN and EU since at least the year 2000. A policy carried out under the auspices of various interconnected globalist agencies and non-governmental agencies such as the International Organization for Migration, Global Migration Group, the Africa-EU Partnership, the World Bank, and the Cult of International Sustainable Development, also known as Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. So once again, right there, it talks about the World Bank. Once again, the world bankers are behind all of this. It's funny how much you look into something that happens in our world, whether that's war, whether that's immigration, just a lot of what is happening in geopolitics. A lot of it can be traced back to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of International Settlements, just these world banking groups all together. So that's kind of funny. But they talk about the UN Agenda 2030. Well, that is absolutely a part of it. This hold on, let me stop that. This evil agenda that was put forward by the UN has been ratified by dozens, if not hundreds of countries across the world, does nothing to benefit us. And in fact, they have something here that I came across called the Migration and the 2030 Agenda, where it's literally calling for this immigration plan right here. And, hold on, actually, let me see if I can quickly move this down. Oh, fuck, cut it off. Anyway, I'll just tell you. So you can see here on the left that a lot of the yellow bars there. Well, I ended up doing a Control F search. So that way you can search for keywords. And I looked up for the word migration. This is a 156-page document, which you can see now. Out of 156 pages, the word migration comes up 1,276 times. And it's too long to really get too much into it. But this is exactly the plan that the migration agenda has. This whole agenda is not beneficial to anybody in the West. It's beneficial to other people in the world, but then even then, not quite. Because if we look over into the agenda itself, it talks about things such as the climate, life below the water, life on land. But the thing is that it's talking about, these areas are talking about reducing they're talking about reducing carbon dioxide. So a lot of countries, a lot of third world countries, poor countries, they don't get in and build themselves up the way that a lot of countries in the West have using the technology that we already have available. Because life has already gotten significantly better for those in the third world than it was even just 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But now, things such as the Paris Climate Agreement, which is also going to be touched on in just a few minutes, things such as this, they end up actually reducing the people to say, oh no, you've got to, all these people in third countries, you now have to start moving towards clean energy. You got to use solar and wind power, but these are much more expensive and not quite as nearly as cheap or beneficial as things such as using oil is right now. So it keeps them down. It's making us go poorer. And just the whole agenda is not truly built for us. It's not built for to actually free people. It's this idea of a utopia, but a utopia is a dangerous idea. And I've said this before, it's been a long time since I've talked about it. But anybody who starts talking about a utopia, run away. Because there is no such thing as a utopia. A utopia would have to be designed for each individual person on this planet, because we're all different. And you can't have a utopia because someone's not going to be happy with it somewhere. And what do you do when they threaten your utopia? You eliminate them. So I just have a quick video here, or just like we're not going to watch the whole video, just a quick clip that I want to cover, where it's this gentleman here. It's actually sort of a compilation where they're talking about Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and it's what I thought was an important part here that I wanted to cover. So we're going to look into that.
The United States government's support for Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, is very clear. In 1992, while the Rio Conference was going on, George Bush, then president, was there where he executed the Agenda 21 protocols on behalf of the United States and brought it back to Washington, D.C. Within a year, Bill Clinton, by executive order, no congressional review, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. In Santa Cruz, we've got a 2-lane freeway system.
Okay, we covered what I wanted to touch up on. So that I thought was kind of interesting because something else that I noticed here is that something else that I noticed was a similarity that happened in America as in Canada. And I've always said that if you want to know what's going to end up happening in Canada, you can look to what's going on in the U.S. A lot of their politics sort of works its way up here. And that's true for a lot of countries around the world. But anyway, that was the fact that a conservative president, a conservative government, ended up coming in and were the ones who ratified the UN Agenda 21, which is now the Agenda 2030. And then it was pushed forward by the next administration, Bill Clinton, which was a left-wing government, a Democrat government. That sounds quite familiar to what ended up happening right here, when our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and a conservative government were the ones who ended up writing it into, who ended up signing on to it. And then it is a liberal government that is pushing it forward, this agenda. And this ended up continuing on. I mean, you didn't hear that, you ended up hearing that George Bush Jr. was going to kill this whole agreement to Agenda 21. Obama didn't kill it. He did a lot to push it forward. And even now, President Trump hasn't killed it. And this is probably going to continue on here, exactly the same way here in Canada. And when I look at things like this, it kind of solidifies in my mind why I don't really have too much support one way or another for a political party, because I find that the way that I've been looking at it, and I think I've maybe used this description here, but I've used it many times before, is with at least in my individual conversations, is that the country is currently in a car driving down a road. At the end of that road is a cliff. Now, when we vote in a new government, all we're controlling is the speed of the car. So sooner or later, we're going to hit that cliff and go off the edge. But none of these governments, nobody of these political parties are campaigning on turning the wheel of the car. And that's what we need to do. And I mean, turning the wheel, you're going to go off-road, you might get some bumps and scrapes, you might hurt yourself a little bit, but you won't kill yourself. And this is the way that I see it going, is that it doesn't really matter. See, the immigration debate that right now they try and throw at us, it's all about numbers. Oh, you know, we don't want, we want 300,000. Oh, 300,000 is too high. No, it needs to be more down to 250,000. And we're going to bring in skilled immigrants. But nobody's talking about the direction that we're heading. Nobody is saying, hey, maybe we've had enough for now. Maybe for the next little bit, at least, we need to stop importing so many people. Maybe all these problems that we're having right now, maybe it's coming because we're bringing in huge different groups of people. Sometimes we're bringing in two different groups that completely hate each other. And then we're creating these little ghettos, not integrating them into our society. They end up fighting each other. And then at the end of the day, it's those civilians, the people, the native-born Canadians that are suffering because of it, because there's no integration. And then we literally have little Somalia, little Africa, little China, all these different groups that are just coming together. They're coming together in their own specific groups. They're coming together as Somalians, they're coming together as Chinese or Mexicans or whatever. And they're not coming together as Canadians. So this whole project of diversity has completely failed us. And it's like, I even think about certain things that are being said, and they're not much different. Like Trudeau says, diversity is our strength. Andrew Scheer says, our strength is our freedom, and our freedom comes from diversity, or something like that. That's not much different than the other. And then Maxime Bernier tries to distinguish himself from both the groups, but he's not really proposing any real radical changes. And a lot of his policies, that this is one of the problems I have, is that a lot of his policies that people are saying he supports or is going to turn against, there's no official written record of him saying that, or it's not available on his website. So how am I supposed to know that that's exactly true? So this is why I tend to sort of stay on the outside of trying to get too much involved in the my party's better than your party arguments, is simply because I don't really see them as any of them doing a very good job right now. So I think that pretty much concludes what I had to say when it came to this immigration pilot program. The next one that what I wanted to talk about has to do with climate change, because very recently, this only happened yesterday or the day before. Today's the 18th, so this was released on the 17th, is that Canada's House of Commons has declared a national climate emergency. The House of Commons has passed a motion declaring a national climate emergency and supporting Canada's commitment to meet the Paris Agreement emission targets. Conservatives MPs voted against the motion, but it still passed 186 to 63 with the support of the Liberals, New Democrat, Bloc Québécois, and Green MPs. So I guess this sort of gives me a little bit of hope that maybe the Conservative Party is turning around its position on the Paris Climate Agreement, because that was Andrew Scheer's first move as the leader. He whipped up his party to vote in favor of that. So I'm hoping maybe he's turning around on that. I don't actually know if that's the case, however. The motion describes climate change as a real and urgent crisis driven by human activity, notes how it is impacting Canadian and states that need to pursue clean growth methods to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, a couple things on that is that I've said before in the past, and I'll say it again, that I believe that the climate is changing. I don't believe the doomsday prophecy that is being presented to us, because if we are to go on the doomsday prophecies, none of them have come true. If the doomsday prophecies were true, then the world would have been destroyed and everyone would be dead before I was even 10 years old. I'm 26 right now. So that was from an AP article in 1989 where it said, oh, the world needs to change the way it's going or we're all going to be dead by the year 2000. Then we had Al Gore's movie that came out and said, by this time, I'm pretty sure he said by about now, that if we didn't change the way we were doing it, half the world would be underwater, including major U.S. cities such as Miami. He even had nice little graphics to go along with this, showing how many people would be displaced, how a third of the entire world would be displaced because of climate change. That didn't end up happening. And this goes on and on and on. And now the new number is 20, if we don't change everything by the year, in 12 years, so that was back in 2018. So if we didn't change everything by the year 2030, then we would all be dead by pretty much 2040. That we had 12 years in order to prevent climate change, or it'd be another doomsday prophecy. But the more and more that I look into this, the more and more I realize that this always tends to happen when the UN is starting to go broke. Because this is, I had one video where I was, where I talked about this, about this idea presented by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they were saying that we have 12 years to change the way that our direction is going. And in that, I noticed how it was that Donald Trump got elected. Donald Trump started pulling funds from the UN. The UN says it's going broke. And then, we need to, the world's going to end in, by about 2040. We need to change this now. We have 12 years. All you countries that aren't paying your fees, you need to pay up. Funny, eh? Funny, good timing on that. And also, it's perfect timing, if you ask me, for something that ended up happening this past week. And what I'm talking about is, if it's a load, is this article that came out. It said Ottawa needs to boost carbon tax by $50 a ton to meet emissions reduction targets, budget officer says. Let's see. The federal government would have to levy an additional carbon tax worth as much as $50 a ton on greenhouse gas emissions to achieve Canada's emission reduction target, the Parliamentary Budget Office said in its report released Thursday. Canada is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement, which committed virtually every country to lowering emissions to try and halt the effects of climate change. Under the agreement, Canada has committed to lowering emissions by some 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. In real terms, that would mean lowering GHG emissions from 732 megatons to 513 megatons by 2030, a target initially pitched by the former Conservative government and agreed to by the Environment Minister Catherine McKenna at the Paris climate talks. Now, the numbers that they're saying would be ridiculous. So where was this? Okay, so this part of the article says, but the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, said Ottawa would have to go further still with the addition of a separate, more broadly based carbon tax starting at $6 per ton in 2023 before rising to $52 per ton in 2030. That would be on top of the current carbon price, which is worth $20 per ton of emissions this year and risen incrementally to 50 tons by 2022. It would also mean that those living in those four provinces, which was Ontario, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, living in those four provinces with their own pricing mechanisms would have to pay as much as $102 per ton by 2030 to ensure Canada hits the Paris targets, which are meant to keep the planet from warming more than 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. So they want you to pay $102 per ton by 2030 for carbon. So that would involve filling up your car. That would involve heating your house. Everything that you do would involve paying a lot more in order just to do it. How is this supposed to help the low-income people, which is the way that the Trudeau government has presented themselves? We're here to help these people who can't make enough money right now. Oh, you poor rich people stealing from the lower income levels. At the same time, we're going to add $102 per ton onto any gas you want to use. How ridiculous is that? Is your gas bill high enough as it is? I know mine is. But once again, this all plays back into the UN Agenda 2030, which I still have it open. Yeah, so it's talking about life below water, climate action, life on land. This is where it comes from. But you can even look back not so long ago where this was detailed out. They detailed what they wanted to do, and this is all to do with giving money back to the UN. So I ended up coming across this. The UN calls for international tax to raise $400 billion to finance development needs. So this is really where the carbon tax comes from. I've even heard rumors that the carbon money that we're going to get, that we're paying into, this carbon tax, is really going to go to finance the UN. It's not being used for ourselves because they say, oh, you're going to get all the money you paid into it back, and that's already turning out to be a con. But this was released on the 5th of July, 2012. And as it says here, the financial need of developing countries has long outstripped the willingness and ability of donors to provide aid. Addressing this challenge, the World Economic and Social Survey 2012, in search of a new development finances, known as the WESS 2012, proposes an international tax combined with other initiatives financing mechanisms to raise more than $400 billion annually for development and global challenges such as fighting climate change. And as we scroll down, realizing the potential, the WESS finds the scope of scaling up or replicating existing initiatives is too limited to meet the need for development financing in the coming decades. Hence, new sources will need to be tapped. Experts who carried out the survey see potential to raise over $400 billion per year through the following mechanisms. Mechanism number 1. A tax on carbon dioxide emissions in developing countries. A tax at $25 per ton would raise an estimated $250 billion per year, collected by national authorities but earmarked for international cooperation. So really, what they're doing is they're saying, you put a $25 carbon tax on this, you raise about $250 billion per year, collected by national authorities, your government, your local government, and earmarked for international cooperation, given to the UN. That is what they're saying. That is the entire point of the carbon tax. But even this down here, it says regular allocations of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights (SDRs) and use of idle SDRs could yield about 100 billion per year for the purchase of long-term assets, which would then be used as development finance. So once again, as I already stated in this video, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, they're behind everything that's going on. We've seen it in the immigration issue that we were just covering. We've seen it now when it comes to climate change and carbon prices. They're involved with this whole thing. Everything that is geopolitical involves these international bankers, and it's all because they want to make their money. Convenient how they throw this in, how it's allowing these international bankers to make about $100 billion per year, made up of exactly the people that are screwing us right now. Unfreaking believable. But there's no reason for Canada to have a carbon tax. I put this out on Twitter just a few days ago, just a brief little thread, where I did some quick research. You look into how much, I looked into how much carbon dioxide we were producing, how many trees we had, how much carbon dioxide one tree absorbs. So I got it right here. And I said, Canada produces 573 million metric tons of CO2 every year. One tree can absorb 48 pounds of CO2 per year. Canada has 318 billion trees. So I'll admit I didn't do extensive research in this, but I think that my numbers are good enough, that they are actually at least close enough to the real numbers that this all works out. So 573 million metric tons equals, it looks to be about 1,263,248,762,000 pounds produced per year. So really 1.2 trillion pounds of CO2 produced each year. 318 billion trees times 48 pounds of CO2 absorbed per tree equals 15,264,000,000,000 pounds absorbed each year. So 1.2 billion of pounds produced to 1.2 trillion pounds of CO2 produced every year to 15.2 trillion pounds absorbed every single year. Why are we paying a carbon tax? But I go on. Canada has approximately 8,953 trees per person. One Canadian produces 22 metric tons of CO2 per year. So 22 tons per person equals 48,501.7 pounds per person per year. 8,953 trees times 48 pounds absorbed every year equals 429,744 pounds absorbed per person per year. So we're at least absorbing 10 times as much CO2 as we produce every single year. And the numbers can be even higher. Like in the original one that I put you there, it was something about 12 times more. 12.2 if I'm remembering correctly. Then I finish with a tree produces 260 pounds of oxygen per year. 318 billion trees times 260 pounds equals 82,680,000,000,000 pounds of oxygen every year. The next time we are being lectured about the carbon tax, remember Canada absorbs 12 times as much CO2 as it produces. So the carbon tax on us is a complete scam. And we know that China has signed on to the Paris climate agreements, yet they're constantly opening up more coal plants every single year. I believe the rates that I heard were that for every single how much Canada produces total of carbon each year, they're opening as many coal plants that could produce that every single year. Now, on top of that, it is fair to say that China is one of the biggest creators when it comes to green energy, but they're also the biggest polluter in the entire world, yet for some reason, Canada is paying for a carbon tax, so that way China can go on and keep benefiting everything. It's unbelievable. Now, this whole idea of the Paris Climate Agreement, the whole idea of whole idea of the Kyoto Protocol or Kyoto Accord, for those who remember that back in the day, that ended up kind of falling apart. That was actually the baby of a man known as Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong was an interesting one. A guy who was born in Canada, I believe Quebec, whose his aunt, I believe it was the good friend of Mao Zedong, the communist leader over there. They were a huge supporter of the communist and Chinese regimes, and it was really him who put in the legwork in order to have these international global organizations, the UN, to come together and start talking about climate change. He almost single-handedly started the climate change movement, which has been slowly but steadily sapping money away from us, from the Western countries. It's giving it to these international organizations, yet for some reason, China's the one who gets away with it. In fact, China even recently just came out and said something about how Canada's not doing enough. We're doing plenty. We have the most forested area, at least in the Western countries, but I'm pretty sure in the world, we have one of the most forested areas. And we absorb probably the most CO2, yet we're not even carbon neutral. We're carbon negative, significantly carbon negative. So actually, we should not be paying anything. Yet there's this con going on that's making us lose our money, while someone like China is actually benefiting more and more from this. It's unbelievable. But anyway, guys, that was really all I had for you today. This video went on longer than I planned to, but I hope you got some use out of it. Let me know what you think about both the stories that I talked about in the comments below, and I'll be back soon, I hope, for another video for you. Take care of yourselves.